Good evening, everybody. So this evening, I will be discussing elements of my PhD research, which looks at how Black women within the Windrush era used clothing as a tool of respectability, survival, and as markers of self-development. One of the questions I'm asking is how successful the adoption of respectability politics was in shedding the historical legacy of plantation life and the subsequent denigration and continued discrimination. I ask this with full knowledge that having access to so-called decent clothing and having the ability to dress well enabled the descendants of enslaved Africans to use their clothing as a way of demonstrating their worthiness and morality whilst distancing themselves from the legacy of slavery. Although there is a lot to unpack, the aim is to investigate the general belief in clothing as signifiers of respectability and what that is intended to cover, and question how issues of racialization and othering impede the ability of the wearer to exude respectability and high value from their appearance. Bearing these factors in mind, the focus of my research is Caribbean women between the ages of 65 and 85, who emigrated to the UK or who stayed on their island in the Caribbean within the middle of the Windrush era timeframe, so around the 1950s and 1960s. I've chosen this group in particular because I recognize them as one of the groups that has been largely absent from the wider discourse on fashion and dress. And I have set these parameters so as to determine the factors that may have influenced how they saw themselves and therefore how they chose to or were able to engage with fashion. Also, my own experiences whilst researching clothing in the Caribbean led me to understand that there were concerns related to older Black women and dress that merited rigorous investigation, and primary to those concerns was the issue of respectability. Far from the usual Western images of the Caribbean as being the place of eternal sunshine, hedonism, and extreme violence, the Caribbean is actually an incredibly religious and pious place where people are still deeply superstitious and very strongly wedded to their cultural beliefs. Nonetheless, the entire region does carry historic baggage due to slavery and colonialism that tends to predetermine how people from these islands are perceived by the wider global society. Throughout my research, I've come to understand this historic baggage leads to the politicization of Black bodies, which has negated the humanity of Black people. One of the ways Black people have sought to distance themselves from this politicization and reclaim their humanity has been through the adoption of respectability. My field of study is based in 3 cities or areas across 3 countries: London, the UK, Kingston in Jamaica, and Eleuthera in the Bahamas. The reason for choosing these places links to the types of environments each place is, and therefore the types of considerations women would have to navigate in order to move freely from one place to another. London, being a hyper-metropolis, is large, foreign, multicultural, and can seem cold both in attitude and temperature. Kingston is comparatively small, but baking, bustling city that has a very local atmosphere. Eleuthera, on the other hand, is one of the 700 islands and keys of the Bahamas and is known as one of the family islands. It's fairly rural, and although there is a center, Governor's Harbour, it is essentially a long island that is divided into settlements that sit along a long road that stretches from one end of the island to the other. And so it is not as developed as somewhere like Nassau, which is the capital city. These different environments should give you an idea of what type of things a young woman in the 1950s or 60s might have to think about when seeking to find a better life for herself. When approaching this research, I not only have to investigate what respectability is, but I have to take into consideration things like cultural identities, manifestation of marginalization, intergroup social politics, development of self and understanding of one's own personhood, as well as Black politicization and the realization of and the freedom to exercise one's agency, including the allowance of enjoyment. Understanding the respectability politics of dress and how Black women from this era may have used clothing as tools to determine their integrity, decency, and virtue, it has also been important to investigate how those things are demonstrated and where respectability is created, as well as taking into consideration the meaning of the personal, political, and social issues I've just mentioned. A useful book has been Righteous Discontent by Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who coined the term respectability politics when writing about women from the US Black Baptist Church in the late 19th and early 20th century, and who discusses in great detail how these women utilized their respectability to exercise their agency in this period. The discussion around Black female agency is one that is paramount to my research and brings its own set of considerations that impact the methodology of this study. Similarly, Saidiya Hartman's work and her use of fabulation to expand on elements of archival documentation that acknowledge Black female existence but fail to engage the Black woman in the telling of her own story has helped me to understand how and why Black women have been left out of stories that largely involve their presence but not their voices, and how important it is to redress that and challenge long-held assumptions. Hartman's work focuses on the retelling of Black female lives and the development of their voices. In so doing, she has provided a narrative for the bitterness of their experiences and an insight into the possible internal thoughts and considerations of these women. This has provided me with an understanding of why Black women are considered disreputable, and therefore why respectability becomes such an important factor in the presentation of themselves. Through understanding the work of Hartman, Tulloch, Hooks, and others, I have realized that the historic beliefs in Black female lasciviousness and carnality are what the adoption of overt decency and prudence is hoping to cleanse. Whereas white women are allowed elements of innocence, the Black female body from childhood to adulthood is marred by projections of lustfulness and hypersexualization. The adoption of respectability can therefore be seen as an attempt to claim some form of innocence through the projection of social propriety. Brooks Higginbotham discusses the politics of respectability when referring to the ideas of orderly cleanliness in the home, behavior, and appearance. She further discusses how it was a suggestion of various organizations that sprung from the women's movement during the 19th and 20th centuries that any deviation from this would surely not align the person with the principles of righteousness and devout Christianity. These protocols are mirrored in the Caribbean. In searching for the origins of Black respectability and who determines the acceptable aesthetics of the Black body, the church and religiosity seems to play a large part in this determination. The idea being that a devotion to God would absolve the Caribbean woman of the sins of not just being female, but of being dirty and wretched. The religiosity in the Caribbean determines that the notion of cleanliness being next to godliness goes hand in hand with the belief that dressing inappropriately or without care goes against scripture and is disrespectful to God. Therefore, dressing in a way that highlighted a person's attempt at righteousness through a smart, clean appearance and upstanding behavior was a way of signifying that they had a firm belief in God and a respect for the divine teachings. The doctrines of the Wesleyan Holiness Church require all women, regardless of age, to cover their head. Addressing the writings of John Wesley, founder of the Wesleyan Church, on covering the head, David Dunlap writes, "Women were allowed to preach in the Methodist ministry, the veil covering a woman's head was required as a sign of her headship to Christ. The woman is a matter of glory to the man who has a becoming dominion over her. Therefore, she ought not to appear except with her head veiled as a tacit acknowledgement of this. With the passage of time, the veil became a hat, and the wearing of a hat was considered correct and appropriate behavior that aligned with the expectations of morality and decency. For women, it was not just considered correct and appropriate, but connoted her deference to God and therefore her alignment with the principles of Christianity. To not do so could be interpreted as a sign of disrespect and impropriety. To provide balance, I must mention that none of this is lost on the men who grapple with their own determinations of respectability, religiosity, and reputation, but also have been plagued with the same projections of hypersexualization. However, projections of hypersexualization for Black men is mixed with the fear of Black male violence and destruction. This is also a projection onto the Black body and has no real basis in balanced fact. In a recent chapter I wrote entitled Performative Elegance for the Dangerous Bodies Anthology, which is being published at the end of this year, I discussed how men coming from the Caribbean had been feeling and what type of image they wanted to portray on their arrival. In 1948 and 1962, the SS Windrush and the SS Begona were the two ships coming from the Caribbean that topped and tailed the Nationality Act, which restricted certain types of immigrants coming into the UK. The British government at the time went to great lengths to stop the SS Windrush docking at Tilbury. However, some historical context of the environment a lot of these people are coming from is necessary. Many of the men and women arriving in 1948 had worked in the Second World War as service personnel or Royal Air Force pilots, and so had served Britain with British soldiers and for all intents and purposes believed themselves to be British subjects and members of the British Empire. On return to their own countries after the war, finding work was difficult as the war had decimated the resources of the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Trinidad, where most of the first wave of immigrants came from. British newspapers that were sold in the Caribbean advertised that various companies were in desperate need of people to fill job roles in the UK. I'm leaving a lot out here, but essentially Caribbean people needed work and British companies needed workers. Therefore, about 1,000 Caribbean immigrants disembarked from an ex-battleship in Tilbury on the 22nd of June, 1948, looking for gainful employment. Black people have known what non-Black people think of them, and the Windrush arrivals were no different. But I think it's fair to say that due to their experiences with Britain and British servicemen during the war, they may have been lulled into a false sense of security as to how they would be received. The adoption of a certain type of dress, a certain type of behavior, became necessary to mitigate against ill thinking, but also to suggest what type of people they were. This was 1948. So it was really important at that time for Black people to demonstrate that they were decent, polite, and well-mannered people who were willing to work hard and not cause problems. In effect, they tried to use their clothes as a way of transcending perceptions of their race. However, in saying this, I don't want to disregard the enjoyment Black people get out of dressing up or popping style, as Carol Tulloch mentions in her book, The Rebirth of Cool. Dressing well is almost part of the DNA in the Black community. This is not to suggest any sort of essentialism, but rather a comment on a diaspora-wide phenomenon that, due to the shared history of dispossession, speaks to the understanding many Black people have about the power of dressing up. This speaks directly to an enjoyment from wearing clothes, knowing that one's clothes will more often than not show them to be appealing, sophisticated, and afford them a sense of what Rex Nettleford called smuddytization. I'm using this theory of smuddytization to understand how, in this case, Black women, identified themselves as being smuddy within a Western environment. For innocence, beauty, and the projected characteristics of femininity to be attributed to the Black woman, colonialism and colonial societies required her to conform to European standards of beauty. This meant straightening her hair and lightening her skin within reason. This enabled the Black woman to not only align with the conventional standard, which gave her an opening into expected models of behavior, but also enabled her to be seen as a viable person and indicated to the wider society at the time that she was malleable and understood her place. This expectation of Black female appearance established a standardization throughout the Americas and Africa that saw the policing of Black women and girls' dress and presentation of self by other Black people that continues to this day. There are countless stories I could relate of natural Black hair not being accepted in schools, in offices, in the army, on TV, etc. And the still ever-present belief that the darker a woman is, the less attractive she is. This slide shows a video still from a 1948 British Pathé clip, which discusses what the announcer seems to find as the astonishing occurrence of a Black woman wearing light face powder, having the permanent wave taken out of her hair with a hot comb, and being styled in the latest 1940s hairstyle by a woman named Carmen England at the British Colonies Club in London. To explain the subtext, just in case any have missed it, this woman is having the natural kinks and coils in her hair, arguably one of the things that identifies her African heritage, straightened out or de-Africanized at a place called the Colonies Club, colonialism being the process of enforced Europeanization. Throughout this research, I've come to appreciate the importance of someone's understanding of their own personhood and how they are then able to embody that personhood in their actions. Personhood, the understanding of oneself as a person separate to any other person and with complete agency, can often be taken for granted. Yet taking away someone's personhood through mistreatment, marginalization, discrimination, abuse, and or continual degradation is something that then has to be reobtained before one can arguably engage in any kind of clothing discourse. This has become a factor when asking myself questions on why women from my chosen demographic, both here and in the Caribbean, behaved the way they did or sought to dress the way they did. On varying levels and in a myriad of ways, I believe they are all attempts to reclaim a sense of self, to reestablish that sense of personhood that determines they are someone of merit and worth. And the final slide is references. If anyone would like to read any of the information, any of the readings that I've to get this information, then they are currently on screen. Please do take a picture or screenshot. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, everybody.